Start recording. Hello, everyone. Welcome. And I'm very pleased to introduce you to Anita D'Amico. And she's going to discuss, do certain types of developers or teams write more secure code? Take it away, Anita.
Okay, thanks very much, Zoe. Today you're going to see my screen, and I'm going to talk about a topic that's near and dear to me, and that is which developers and teams are more likely to write vulnerable software. And a little bit about the background of why I'm interested in this topic. A lot of you may know me from when I was at Secure Decisions. I was the director of Secure Decisions, which did cybersecurity R&D. And some of you may also know me as the CEO of Code DX in the application security space. What many of you may not know about me is that my background is in experimental psychology, that the PhD is in psychological research. And I wandered into cybersecurity through a very circuitous path, which I'll talk about some other time. But everything that I've done in cybersecurity, I've been interested in the human element behind it. And so while I was involved in application security and we're working on the technology, one of the reasons I was interested in working and developing Code DX was because it's about how to support human decision-making in application security. And so I started to think about are there certain characteristics of developers or their teams or the work environment that makes them more likely to introduce vulnerabilities in code or to write more secure code. Now, we've always heard about technologies that are used in application security, but we don't hear much about the people involved in application security. So I was interested in doing that research. And so I wound up getting a research grant from DARPA and started studying this. And you're going to see today the results of some of the scientific investigation that we did in this area. So that's a little bit about my background. And now let's talk about what I want to talk about. So the first thing in tonight's discussion is, why should we be investigating human factors that affect code quality and security? Why bother? The next thing I'll talk about is how this research is actually conducted. And then third, the highlight is what has been discovered so far. What do we know based on scientific evidence about how work environment does or does not contribute to secure code development? What about the team characteristics? And what about developers' behaviors? And then finally, I'm going to wind up with some things that we've learned from other work domains, such as transportation or the healthcare industry. What are they doing to improve human performance there? And are there lessons that we can learn in software development from those other work domains? So that's the lineup for tonight. And now let's get into it. So the first question is, why should we investigate human factors that affect code quality and security? Well, I'm preaching to the choir here. You all know that software vulnerabilities are a major gateway to breaches. In fact, most breaches in the information industry are traced back to an attacker exploiting a software vulnerability. And because of that, we really need to find those vulnerabilities before they are put into production. And the problem is that we're not very good at doing that in many ways. Software vulnerabilities actually will often remain undiscovered for many years. So if you just look at open source, which has a lot of people looking at it all the time, Heartbleed took 2 years to discover. And in that time, about 500,000 secure web servers were vulnerable. The Apache Struts vulnerability, which was the vulnerability that was exploited in the Equifax breach, actually existed in the code for 4 years before it was discovered. And there are other studies that have been done of open source, and on average, 2 years go by from the time that a vulnerability is actually entered into the code until the time that it is discovered and publicly disclosed. So that's an awfully long time to sit out there and get exploited. So people are trying to do things to find those vulnerabilities before they reach production. And one of the things that you do is manual code reviews. Another thing that you do is you run source code analyzers, SaaS tools like Coverity and Fortify, checkmarks. And those are good, but they have shortfalls. So when you do manual code reviews, it's kind of like, where's Waldo? It's like, where do I look first? And now I'm trying to find issues in the code. Where do I start? And sometimes you can miss the vulnerabilities because there's so much stuff to look at. And then there are static code analyzers, SaaS tools. And there's a lot of them out there. There's over 100 of them out there. And one of the things that people don't realize is that a single SaaS tool will find on average about 14% of the vulnerabilities. Now, I know that sounds astonishing, but it's based on research that was done by the National Institute of Standards and Technology and NSA. About 10 years ago, NSA created a software project that with known vulnerabilities in it. So they knew exactly where the vulnerabilities were. And then the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, took a bunch of commercial and open source SaaS tools and ran them against that software. And what they found was that on average, a SaaS tool finds about 14%, but each one actually finds a different 14%, so that you actually have to run a whole bunch of SaaS tools to get good vulnerability coverage. So they're all kind of fine-tuned to find certain things. And in the course of running a whole bunch of tools like that, you have a lot of noise that comes out. If anybody's ever run a SaaS tool, you know you have thousands of security issues that are come out. So you can find it, but you can find the vulnerabilities, but it's where do you start looking in those thousands of security issues? Now, just in case you were wondering whether or not a study from 10 years ago that was done by NIST is still effective, sure, SaaS tools have improved, but let me show you the results of something that we did at CodeX. We took 9 SaaS tools and we ran them against WebGoat. You're probably familiar with WebGoat. It's an OWASP project that is a vulnerable web application. And then we saw how many of the security issues were found by 1 tool, 2 tools, 3 tools, etc. 90% of the security issues were found by just a single tool. It wasn't one, the Uber tool. It was like all these different tools, but just one. So you really have to run a bunch of tools, and then you have to look through a lot of noise to find the stuff that's really important. So you're wondering, how does this relate to human factors? Well, I started wondering, for both the manual code review and the SaaS problem, would it be helpful to know where to hunt for the vulnerabilities in the code? Like if you do a manual code review, wouldn't it be great if somebody could say, start here? This is where you're more likely to find vulnerabilities. Or if you're looking at the issues that are found by a SaaS tool and you have 2,000 of them, wouldn't it be useful to know that there's certain characteristics of the code that you want to look at first? So that's where I got into this notion of human factors. What if we could find that there were certain characteristics about a developer or the team that developed the code, or maybe when the code was written, like what time of day it was written, or maybe even where it was written? Would that tell us how to orient and to find these vulnerabilities? So that was kind of the motivation for my doing this kind of research. And now I want to talk about human factors themselves. Now I've been using that term, and it may be one that you're not familiar with. So let me explain what it is. Human factors are properties of people and your environment that affect human performance. And they come in a variety of types. So there's psychological human factors. For example, how you as an individual can focus your attention, or how good is your short-term or long-term memory. And then there's group psychological human factors, such as how do groups resolve conflict, or how do they communicate with each other. There's also physiological human factors, such as if you're really sensitive to sound, you may be more distracted by noise in your environment, and it may affect your performance more than people who are less sensitive. Fatigue can have an effect on performance, and something called circadian rhythm, which is the changes that your body goes through during the course of a 24-hour period. There are certain diurnal cycles that happen to our bodies that are just follow the 24-hour clock, and that can affect human performance. And then finally, there's environment. Distractions can affect it, their temperature, lighting. Now, these types of human factors are studied and fairly significantly in safety critical systems. So nuclear power plants, aviation, in healthcare, these are examples where there's a lot of emphasis on human factors. Yet there are software developers who are developing code for those safety critical systems, and we're not paying much attention to the human factors that affect good software engineers. So that's why there is research that's being done in this area. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this research is done, because it's actually kind of hard to do. So let's start with what you study. So when you do a research project like this, there's two parts to it. The first part are the human factors. And these are things like a developer's attention. Is he or she context switching? What about the team size? Co-location, number of hours that people work, the time of day, things like that. And then what you're trying to do in this kind of research is figure out how those human factors affect something, an outcome. And that outcome is code security and code quality. And there's a variety of ways that you can measure that. In open source, you can look at publicly disclosed vulnerabilities, as well as the number and type of security issues that you find with SaaS tools. If you're doing proprietary code, you can't look at publicly disclosed vulnerabilities. You really have to look at the results of SaaS tools or bug frequency and failure rates. So anybody who's doing research on this is usually looking at the effect of some predictor, some human factor on some outcome, which is code security and code quality. Now, how is this done? Well, first of all, there are a great source for doing this research is open source repositories. And like Linux kernel, Chromium, Postgres, Apache Struts. And we know what the known vulnerabilities are in the code. We don't know what the unknown vulnerabilities are, but we know what the known ones are. And so what researchers have done, and I have on the right there a couple of the companies and individuals where they work that are doing this research. But what we do is we take the open source and we take all the files in the open source and we divide them into two piles. A pile that has at least one publicly disclosed vulnerability and a pile that has no publicly disclosed vulnerability. And what we try to do is we try to figure out how are these piles different? What's different about the pile with the public vulnerabilities versus the other one? And that's where we start looking at indicators of human factors. So in a code repository, you can look at the time of day by looking at the time of a commit and adjusting for local time. You can look at team size by looking at you can infer it by looking at the number of contributors to a file. You can look at communication and churn, things like that, by looking at the activities of contributors to the repo. So when I get into the results of this research, think about these two piles and what separates them. Now, there's other types of research that's done, and this is really interesting. Rochester Institute of Technology, a guy named Dr. Andy Manili, is doing something called the Vulnerability History Project. What he does, he and his students, is they take a known vulnerability in open source and they trace it all the way back in time to the originating commit. And then they look in the repo to see what was happening with that developer in that repo at the time of the originating commit. What was the developer doing? Who else was contributing to the code? Was there a lot of churn? Those types of things. And then they go forward in time to the time that it was discovered to see were there opportunities to discover it that were missed, and if so, why? It's very interesting. And then lastly, there are private organizations like Microsoft and AT&T that have done studies of human factors on secure code development and code quality. And there they have the opportunity to do proprietary code studies, which gives them more access to the developers themselves because they know who the developers are. They know where they're physically located. They know how they communicate. And so it's a very rich source of information, but there are very few studies like this. So let's move on to what was found. So the way we're going to do this is I'm going to ask a question such as, does team co-location influence code quality? And I think Zoe's going to put up a poll. So I think, Zoe, did you put up a poll? Yeah. So does co-location of the development team influence code quality? So do you think that people who are close together, who are co-located physically, are more likely to develop good quality code than people who are remote? Okay, so most people think that yes, it makes a difference. And oops,
Right.
There we go.
Mike, I think I'm announcing this. So 64% say yes, and 36% say no. And I believe in that. I don't know what you're going to say about that, but I hear when I'm talking to clients that it's important for the team to be together.
So let's see.
So I said 64% said yes, and 36% said no.
So Microsoft did this study of post-release failures in Windows Vista and Office 2010 binaries. And they were very interested in this topic. They actually studied teams that were co-located in the same office, in the same building where they shared a cafeteria, on the same campus, in the same region, or across continents. And the answer is no.
Ooh.
There was no difference in the failure rates between the teams. Whether they were in the same building, cafeteria, campus, continent, didn't make any difference. But there was something that did make a difference. There was something that predicted that was correlated with the higher rate of failure. And I'm going to tell you about that in a few minutes. So let's go on to the next question. Does the time of day when a code is committed influence the code quality? So let's go to the next poll.
Hang on one moment. Sorry. Posting it. Feel free to chant Jeopardy music or something. Apologies for the delay.
No, I'm not a singer.
We got some talent here. That's good.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive.
I'm not sure why.
Well, we'll skip this one. Okay, we'll skip the poll. Get ready for the next one. I have a few more questions.
Wait a minute. So what time of day? We're gonna skip it, or are you gonna just?
No, I'm going to give you the answers, but we
Okay.
can skip the poll.
All right.
Do you want to take a guess, Guy, or anybody else want to take a guess?
I already got one wrong.
Somebody
The
else?
time of day of code. I'm gonna say no.
Okay.
And you're smiling, so I got it wrong again.
Well, let's see. The answer is yes, make a difference.
Yep. Okay.
That late night commits have a lot more bugs than morning commits. That when you look at the code that is committed between midnight and 4 a.m. has a lot more bugs in it than code that is committed between 7 a.m. and noon. And this wasn't at all surprising to me. And the reason is because of something that I mentioned a few minutes ago, and that is circadian rhythm. So our bodies have a natural clock in it. And there are certain chemicals in the body called catecholamines that regulate our level of alertness. And it is these chemicals are they're pretty high in the morning. They dip down at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You wonder why there's siesta? It's not because you had a heavy lunch. It's because your level of alertness actually goes down to about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Then it comes back up in the afternoon and it continues high until about 10, 11 o'clock at night when it drops precipitously, these chemicals in your body, and they don't start coming back up again until 6 in the morning. So I don't know why late night commits have more bugs, but as a psychologist, my theory is that it has something to do with circadian rhythm.
So I guess that's why, you're doing well, or Codex is doing well, because you talk to a lot of developers and they do like writing in the middle of the night.
Yep. We're gonna talk more about that. I would not recommend that.
Yeah,
There's scientific evidence is against it. And by the way, a lot of people say, well, what about people who are on shift, like if you permanently shift? So there are some people who can actually shift their body clock, but a lot of people can't. So if you have somebody in the medical community that always does the night shift, they may be able to adapt, but some people just can't. We are hardwired as human beings over many years of evolution to shut our bodies down at about 10 o'clock at night. And forcing it otherwise is not generally a good idea. So let's go to another question. Is the poll ready for this one? Does the developer's level of attention influence code security? Now, before you answer this question, and you bring the poll up, Zoe, but let me talk about attention, because it's really hard to measure a developer's attention. It's certainly really hard to do in open source when people are distributed, and short of actually asking people about how focused they are, which I've done, by the way, in research, it's hard to do. So there's a way of inferring it in this type of research, and it's called unfocused contribution. This is something that's used in studying open source. It's an indicator of how much attention a developer is focusing on specific files. So a file has high unfocused contribution if the developers of that file are also busy developing, introducing code into other files as well. So a file has unfocused contribution if the developer is spreading his or her attention around across a bunch of files. And you could actually see this in a repo based on the timing of their contributions. Similarly, and one of the other things about these files is that if you have a lot of unique contributors who are adding to the file, and those developers are also spreading their attention around, the file's not getting a lot of love and attention and focus by a developer. So do we have a poll on this? Okay, so here are the questions. So does the developer's focused attention influence security? And there's 3 types of answers we can have to this. The first is, some people believe that many eyes make good security. So this is, oh no, sorry, that's a different question. So nobody answered this poll. Is that right?
Yeah, I grouped them together, but we can go through them one at a time.
Okay. All right.
Ben wasn't catching up to you, Anita.
Sorry about that.
No, it's a good thing. We got to stay sharp and learn to stay faster than the devices.
Okay, so most people feel as though the developer's focus attention does make a difference. And I've certainly talked to enough software engineers who talk about being in the zone that and it's really true. And the answer is yes, that the more unfocused contribution, the more insecure the code. That, remember those two piles of open source, you know, like you take Chromium, you get a pile that have vulnerabilities and a pile that don't. The pile that have vulnerabilities have a lot more developers who are spreading themselves across a whole bunch of different files. That they're just not focusing on one thing or two things. Now, in addition to looking at these publicly disclosed vulnerabilities, I also did a study where we took 4 repos, 2 open source and 2 proprietary. And we ran static code analyzers on them. And we looked at the correlation between unfocused contribution and the static analysis findings. And what we found was that those files that had developers who were spreading themselves thin across a lot of files, they had a lot more security issues that were found by the SAS tools. So you really need to have developers focus their attention. Don't spread them around too many things, and don't let them spread themselves across too many things. Let them concentrate on specific files and modules. Okay, ready for another question? Do the number of developers who contribute to a file influence code quality and security? And there are a couple of theories on this. One is that it does make a difference, and the more developers, the better for security, because there's many eyes make good security. There's another school of thought that is that the number of developers has an effect on security and quality in a negative way, because too many cooks spoil the broth. And then there's a third school of thought where it really doesn't make any difference, the size of the team, the number of developers. So I'm looking at the poll, and Guy, did you want to make the announcement as to?
I'm waiting to see it come up.
I can see it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I don't have it.
Okay, well,
You're gonna have to make the announcement.
You're here
I'll-
simultaneously.
So the poll is that almost, but 67% of our respondents think that too many cooks spoil the broth, and that the more developers, the worse the security. And you are right, that more developers there are, the more quality issues. In fact, remember that Microsoft study that I talked about where they were looking at how co-location affects failure rates, and they found like no difference? So then they went back and looked at the data and said, well, is there anything that is correlated with higher failure rates? And the answer was, the more developers on the team, the more likely the code was to have high failure rates. Now, that's quality. What about security? The answer is yes. The more developers that you have on a particular file or module, the more security issues there are. So do you remember the 2 piles, the pile with the vulnerabilities and the pile without? Well, some researchers did that for Linux. And they found that source code files with 9 or more developers were 16 times more likely to have a vulnerability than files that had fewer developers.
Wow.
Oh, it gets better. Chromium. Files with 9 or more developers were 68 times more likely to have a vulnerability than those with fewer developers. Apache web server. Files with 9 or more developers were 117 times more likely to have a vulnerability than those with fewer than 9 developers. So that's in looking at the number of publicly disclosed vulnerabilities. We also looked at static code analysis findings. We ran 4 projects, 2 open source and 2 proprietary. And we found that source code files where there were more developers had found more security issues with SaaS tools. So that's pretty significant, right? And you don't want to, if you have some issue with your software, you don't want to keep on piling more developers on it. Now, the question is, why is this so? Why would number of developers affect code quality or security? But we don't really know, but one theory is something called the bystander effect. So, if 2 people witness something, they said, did you see that? Yeah, did you see that? Oh, we better do something about it. 3 people is like, did you see that? No. Did you see that? Yes, we better do something about it. Once you get like to 4 or 5, the more possible combinations, the more likely people are to think that somebody else called it in. Somebody else did something about it. So that's just one theory as to why this might be at play. There are other theories such as communication networks. Once you get above 6 people, like the type of communication that you have with each other gets very complex. Now, this isn't always the case. Sometimes with quality issues, more developers do not necessarily contribute to more quality issues. So it's not like as universal as it is with security. There was a study of telephone switching software that found there was no correlation between numbers of developers and bug fixes. And AT&T found that the numbers of developers contributing to a file had really a negligible effect on fault prediction. But I would say if you're running a software group, you want to keep your development team limited, on a specific module so that people are focused, and keep that idea also of focused attention. So I think we're ready for another question. Does developer experience influence code quality?
And we have 13 or 81% said yes, and 3 or 19% said no.
And they're right. The yeses have it. But let's talk about how you measure developer experience. So in an open source repository, what we're talking about with developer experience is the number of commits to the repository. So they have a lot of commits to that repository, and the time since their first commit. And they've been doing it frequently. So it's not like they had a whole bunch of them 5 years ago and now they have a whole bunch of them. They've been consistently contributing. That's high developer experience. And what is found is that the more developer experience, the higher the quality of the software. Microsoft found that if you have software where there are minor contributors, some people call them flyby, or drive-by contributors, then yet they have more pre and post release failures. So if you have somebody who just comes in, drops some code and leaves, and they're not part of the regular team, you're more likely to have failures in pre and post release failures. And in the Linux kernel and Postgres, they found that experienced developers had fewer buggy commits as well. Now, this isn't really speaking to how many years in the industry somebody has had. This is talking about experience with the code base. I don't know if it would extend to people who just have a lot more experience. I think we have one more question. Yes, one more question. So this is a question about how developers interact with each other's code. Now, there's a concept in code development called churn, how many changes you're making to the code. That's code churn. Interactive churn measures the percentage of changes that were made by somebody else to somebody else's code. So, John wrote some code, Mary comes in and changes the code, then Jim comes in and changes it again. That's interactive churn. So, Zoe, you want to reveal the results?
So the results are 15 or 88% said yes, and 2 or 12% said no.
Well, we have a very smart audience here. The answer is yes, it does make a difference. That when you look at Chromium and Apache, the files that, remember those piles, the pile that had at least one known vulnerability, they had a lot more interactive churn than the pile that didn't have a vulnerability. So when people start mucking around in other people's code, it is associated with a lot more vulnerabilities. So that ends the Q&A portion of our program. The next thing I just wanted to talk about, and this will be the end of my briefing, is are there lessons that we can draw from other domains? And so let me point to a couple things here. Transportation spends a lot of time looking at human factors. In fact, the FAA publishes something called the Dirty Dozen list of 12 human factors that lead to the most transportation accidents. Medicine and healthcare also pay a lot of attention to human factors. And OSHA, which is basically regulating safety and health organizations, they pay a lot of attention to factors that human factors that affect safety. So let's see what some of those are. One of the big areas is fatigue. My doctoral dissertation was on fatigue, so I'm always interested in this topic. It was on fatigue and circadian rhythm. So when you look at human performance, once somebody is awake for 17 to 19 hours, then their performance goes down to be equivalent to somebody who's had a couple of drinks. So if you got up at 6 o'clock in the morning and now it's 11 o'clock at night, your performance is going to be as though you had a buzz on. In medicine, there are regulations now about how many hours medical student residents can work. And the rules are that they can't work more than 80 hours per week. And when you do the arithmetic, that comes out to about 12, 13 hours a day, which is very similar to what we saw in those other studies, where if somebody starts a shift at 7 o'clock in the morning, then by about 9 o'clock at night, they're wasted, and they're going to make poor decisions, or decisions equivalent to what they may do if they had a couple of drinks in them. And then there's regulations for commercial truck drivers, which is that you can't work more than 11 hours. Now, think about that. Just what does that tell us about those developers who are pulling all-nighters, right? Who are working, 12, 16-hour days. The last, after you go past about 11 hours, your performance is going to go down. And that's the code you want to look at for quality and security issues. The other thing that we've learned from other industries is culture. That is particularly in medicine, that if you instill a safety culture, then people make fewer mistakes. So ICUs, intensive care units, if you instill a safety culture in an intensive care unit, and let's say basically fewer patients die and people aren't in the hospital as long. In fact, there are studies that actually looked at ICUs before they instilled a safety culture and afterwards. And across the board, the outcomes, which means people aren't as sick and they don't die as often, improve when you have safety culture. And you've been hearing more and more about security culture. Well, a security culture can affect the level of attention that developers give to designing security into software, and also how they respond to security issues. Like, there's some developers who would say, I just need to get this out. I need to get this feature out it's not important. Even if it's insecure, I got to get this out. But if you have a security culture, they may act differently. So last slide. How do I apply these findings in your workplace? So if you were to take something away from today, I hope you take this away. Use human factors to point you to the code that might have vulnerabilities. Look for code that was committed after midnight. Look for files where there are 9 or more developers, and files where the developers are often editing each other's code. Now, suppose you're running an organization, a software development organization. What can you do? Keep your developers focused on just a few files. Don't spread them across a whole bunch of stuff, and limit the number of developers that are contributing to files. 9 is too many. How many is too many? We don't know. We know that 9 is. I don't know where to draw the line. Limit your developers' daily work to no more than 11 hours, and discourage people from working between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. That's particularly hard in the pandemic because some people have kids at home during the day, and so then they go to work at night. But you better look at their code. Review code by developers who've had very little experience with the code base. Even if they are experienced developers, if they're new to the code base, check their code and introduce a security culture. So that's the presentation. I hope you found it interesting, and I'd love to take questions.
Well,